No, I don't want to see this fucking shit.
No. In Dragon Age, folks.
It's got so many degenerate elements in it, I refuse to play it.
Dragon Age has been gay since 2009. It's not stunning and brave anymore. It's tiresome and hackneyed.
They do have pronouns in the game.
And the game director is literally a jump scare. Sorry about that.
They're putting actual transgender ideology in the game.
If it's all about representation, seeing yourself in the game, scars and all, well, there's a little problem with that because you're not an elf.
I would have as equal an objection if all of a sudden I was playing Mario and he decided to stop and talk about his Catholic faith as an Italian.
They don't want you to be able to escape this agenda no matter what, and including things like a goddamn Kunari of all races. Telling you that they're non-binary is so ridiculous, because the Kunari are a tribal people who value strength and honor above all other things.
It would be just as lore-breaking in a world where you can change your gender with magic and you can heal wounds with healing magic, for you to decide to opt to chop off your titties and have trans surgery scars.
Queerified Kunari, which used to look really cool in past Dragon Age iterations, Kunari were like really cool looking. And now they just look trunified.
Yeah, I don't like it.
Dragon Age series creator David Gator has recently opted to respond to some of these complaints by remarking how the usual suspects are upset at how woke the new Dragon Age is, an apparent sudden and unexpected development in the series. The industry veteran called the people who spread this sentiment effing tourists in a recent Blue Sky post.
Recently, the formerly announced Dragon Age Dreadwolf was rebranded as Dragon Age the Veilguard, and given the official release of October 31st, 2024. If you've been following me on Twitch for long enough, you'll likely know I'm a big fan of the Dragon Age games and recently finished uploading cuts of my old 2020 and 2021 playthroughs of those games to my second channel. Be warned, the audio capture and editing on those is even rougher, but it took me this long to get them all up, because when I accidentally trashed my old PC, I had to rescue and recover a bunch of my files off of it. And there was something in the range of weeks and weeks worth of video game stream VODs on there, so naturally getting all that Elder Scrolls and Dragon Age stuff off there took a lot of time. I've gotten up to a lot of different types of content creation since the era of streaming Oblivion and Dragon Age Inquisition straight from my Xbox, and while I like to think I've come a long way, fantasy writing and gaming are such huge passions of mine that they've never faded. You might also know, if you're a patron of mine, that I've been working on videos about different elements of the Dragon Age series for half a year now, and those videos have included content about just how much depth this series gives to gay relationships. Calling Dragon Age one of the gayest fantasy RPGs on the market would be both an overgeneralization and an understatement. No game series has given quite as much care to LGBT identities as this one, with both moving emotional scenes and respectful, humanizing characterization to spare across multiple games and books. The first game, Dragon Age Origins, effectively had 2 locked straight characters and 2 bisexual characters, romanceable by characters of any gender. The second game exclusively featured bisexual romance options, but the third game had bisexual romance options, straight locked options, and for the first time, all the way back in 2014, locked homosexual characters. This will all be, and has all been, the subject of a number of other videos, as there's just so much to dig into in this series, but these games have always represented the willingness of the developers to listen and accommodate people in their audience who might not have been listened to or accommodated in that way in the past. Individual characters have always had plot-relevant gay storylines, with the most pronounced of these being Anders, but of course other characters like Zevran and Dorian also contribute to just how much depth this series has. For what it's worth, the books are like this as well. David Gator's The Calling, published in 2009, has a major conflict in the middle of its narrative centered around 2 gay Grey Wardens and their relationship. Patrick Weeks's The Masked Empire, published in 2014, similarly features a prominent gay relationship and even opens with an acknowledgement of how the LGBTQ fans of the series have contributed to it, and how important their feedback has been. In a world where the place of LGBT people hasn't always been certain or safe, fandom can and often does fulfill that role for some people. We'll dig into that a bit more later, but for now, we have to talk about the Veilguard. I will link the release date trailer below so you can watch it with your own eyes and evaluate it for yourself, but I'm planning this video out such that it will go live around the time when the game comes out, which obviously requires writing it beforehand. Naturally, I feel the need to give some pre-release thoughts about what we know so far, but I'm withholding final judgment until I play the actual game myself. I've heard people for years tell me that Dragon Age 2 is complete garbage and Dragon Age Inquisition isn't much better, but honestly, DA2 isn't that bad, and Inquisition is my favorite game in the series, so I don't really go by what other people say. You should look into these sorts of things for yourself and make your own determinations, you know? Don't let YouTubers spoon-feed you all your opinions. Despite going in with an open mind and some time for reflection given I don't have a good gaming PC or next-gen console, which is also why I haven't played Baldur's Gate 3 yet to my endless immiseration, I do have a few thoughts on the Veilguard. The first thing to note is that it's almost impossible for this game to live up to its original hype in concept. The Trespasser DLC for Inquisition was just such a big deal, and the lore implications of this game are so massive that I cannot stress enough the degree to which this is a load-bearing release for the series, which undoubtedly will need to spread some of its story out to DLCs or sequels. The whole conflict with Solus, the Elven Gods, the Old Gods, the Blights, and everything tying them all together is probably the most massive content drop in the history of the series. It's too big to be resolved in one game, and I wouldn't expect it to be. There are a couple positives, depending on your perspective. The sound design and voice acting that have been teased so far seem to come across as pretty solid advancements of what we've gotten previously. Inquisition was another high point in that regard for me personally. I just love the crinkly noises that the Mark and the Rifts make when they spark and ripple. More of that looks like a good sign. I'm also a big fan of some of the returning characters that have been teased, as well as the location of the game, Tevinter. If you haven't seen the Netflix series Dragon Age Absolution, I recommend checking it out as a good teaser for the setting, and yet another great example of tasteful gay relationships in the series. I'm also way less harsh on the graphics than other people seem to be. The lighting looks way more dramatic and dynamic than anything we've gotten so far, and the hair and cloth physics have come an extremely long way from what you'll see even in this Inquisition footage. My only gripe is that the character designs look a little smooth in places, like the foreheads of the Kunari, but it's not like it's worse than the old games. I've always been more of an I want better games with worse graphics and I'm not kidding kind of person, but that's not to say that I don't appreciate improved graphics. I just wish my older hardware could run it. Time to seriously think about how I'm gonna upgrade, I suppose. On the flip side, there are a few potential negatives. The first, and for me only genuinely truly concerning issue, is the lack of save imports. Every time I look at statements from the developers, I get severe mixed messages about what exactly the world state is going to entail, and the updates to the Dragon Age Keep, the online webpage that allows players to customize the events of the world of Thedas, haven't helped my confusion. Every time I hear other creators try to explain it, they also seem to iterate on some of the mixed messages. I don't know, I guess I just wish BioWare was more clear with how they presented their vision for the series. I'll know by this weekend when I try the game out. The Dragon Age Keep has been useful for players to set up their playthroughs for the events of each game to fit their previous decisions, and I wonder if maybe the Veilguard isn't trying for a slightly more isolated story before the plot of its DLC or sequel takes things back to what's going on in the rest of the world. That might make sense, since we've never been to Tevinter, and it seems the game uses prompts so the player can fill in the blanks and the story can proceed. Dragon Age 2's custom world state did something similar, or at least it did so as an option, so it's not totally out of the question for BioWare. I suppose we'll see. Other players seem more hesitant than I am about the combat changes. I do still hope party-centric combat is core to the gameplay loop, but I know BioWare has been steering the series towards a more action RPG style for some time, so I'm not surprised. Basically, every release has been more action-oriented. And while I understand the principle of preferring strategy-based tactical combat, and I do think games like that are fun, I've liked the combat of the series more and more as it's evolved, so I'm willing to give it a shot before I make a judgment call. This has been a long way of giving you a hopefully consistent impression of some of the potential draws and pitfalls of the title out now. What is not, however, a problem in Dragon Age is its LGBT content. That has been a consistent fixture of the series since its first release, and has been a huge draw for a long time, giving players a ton of creative liberty to explore compelling character dynamics in the midst of a larger story. However, because right-wing content creators posturing as the last true gamers need to pander with literally every new release, and because I have a deep abiding love for this series, and because I have nearly 35 gigabytes of Inquisition footage currently captured and loaded onto my PC anyway, I figured why not? Let's do this. Who's on first?
So Grums reports this to us because there was a leak that happened. A leak. Okay, so Dragon Age Veilguard leak, worst fears confirmed, and it's much worse than we think. This is the end of BioWare, Grum says.
The lovely individual you just watched was a woman named Melanie Mack. Don't worry, I won't torture you by making you watch her stumble through reading a tweet like it's her first time on the internet. There's a Dead Domain video covering some of her content that I'd recommend for a little background if you're curious. It might help you understand why it sounds like her mouth is so dry in that clip. Melanie is a real card. She postures hard as a Christian nationalist, but doesn't tend to demonstrate much familiarity with Christianity. She consistently expresses a deep hatred for gay and transgender people, which would frankly have felt out of touch, cartoonish, and over the top in 2004, much less 2014, much less 2024. Her persona has a paper-thin emotional veneer that places her firmly in a zone of zero self-awareness, at times seeming equally likely to be lying or just delusional. Despite whatever may be motivating her hateful right-wing content pivot, you can see her here showing off a tweet from Mark Kern, also the subject of a great Dead Domain video, link in the description again, citing the recent supposed interview between a small content creator, Nure, however it's pronounced, and an alleged Dragon Age the Veilguard playtester. If it seems like these people just regurgitate their bile into each other's mouths like a bunch of confused baby birds, it's because they do. Nur is a Twitch gaming streamer whose YouTube channel seems to have popped up over the past year almost exclusively to take shots at BioWare and Dragon Age the Veilguard in particular. They aren't an otherwise reputable source and seem to be farming engagement. For the life of me, I'll never understand the people who cast doubt on the idea that you can farm clout with rage bait. How successful you'll be is anyone's guess, but as I discussed in an upcoming video, YouTube's algorithm rewards SEO or search engine optimization practices with strong emotional hooks, and while both strong positive and strong negative emotions work, I think we all know the bar for making someone extremely happy and the bar for making someone extremely angry are set at quite different heights. You see, reputable journalistic outlets have at least theoretical editorial standards, which require an interview by a journalist to be resubjected to the eyes of another supposedly impartial person. Don't worry, we'll get into this momentarily. The important thing to note here first, however, is that YouTubers and Twitch streamers don't individually have the organizational and institutional backing to manage something like that at a level where they would be recognized as academically rigorous and journalistically reliable. This means that you might not want to believe them when they pull the anti-woke equivalent of, "my dad works at Nintendo." Why you would treat them as reputable at all is, of course, beyond me. Years upon years of anti-journalist sentiment, among other things, have made gaming communities ripe for right-wing infiltration, because while anti-corporate and anti-intellectual sentiments are not the exclusive domain of the political right, they do mesh well with certain other right-wing ideological proclivities, an exhaustive exploration of which would make this video frankly unwatchable. The chief thing I want to point to here, however, is the tendency to utilize what you might call alternative facts. The reality of the situation and the direction the evidence points isn't relevant to anti-woke hucksters, which is why they regularly catastrophize about games they haven't played and shows they haven't watched, spread unproven and unverified claims, and otherwise admit in their less sensible moments to not caring whether the things they say they believe are true. This last quality is so inevitable that almost invariably when arguments about this issue reach a certain pitch, fans of anti-woke content creators clamber to be the first to toss a tu quoque fallacy into the mix. If you say anti-woke talking points are based on poor reasoning and a lack of evidence and their talking points are often lies, they'll jump to talking about how their ideological opponents do the same thing. This is another admission by default. Hypothetically, if you accuse me of lying, and instead of disputing the claim by showing evidence, I do either of the following things, there's a strong likelihood that I am trying to deceive you. The first tactic is something I've already mentioned, namely deflecting by gesturing at imagined hypocrisy. This one is great because even if I said this and believed it, I would still be admitting to being comfortable believing and spreading lies, which is an admission of guilt. The second tactic is a bit more subtle. Instead of deflection, it's obfuscation. If you can't meet a claim on its merits and you can't go on the offense right away, you might try muddying the waters by making overly granular arguments about definitions. If you can make things granular enough and do it enough times, the fact that you can't dispute anything won't necessarily matter. because you don't have to. It's a way of arguing with pure rhetoric. These are two of the major tactics people running interference for anti-woke slop purveyors use, and recognizing when someone is doing those allows you to see tacit admissions where they would rather that you didn't. But hold on, I just used a contentious word, didn't I? Fixating on contentious words is, like getting lost in the weeds of definitions, another great deflection tactic. But I called these channels slop content, and I meant it. People use that word slop to mean something is bad. I don't use it that way. When I say something is slop, I mean it's workshopped and indistinct. A lot of these channels keep making the same videos with the same point over and over and over and over and over and over. They rarely have more evidence or better arguments. It's the same news on permanent repeat, day in and day out. And naturally they have their rationalizations, but that's slop, baby. You might fantasize about being better than major media companies, but you're still producing and guzzling down your own brand of culture industry slop, with arguably more zeal and less room for critical thought. And that's the point, I think. In one of the Steam community threads about this NER leak, one of the users said, "Aren't you guys ashamed of appearing so gullible on the internet?" The answer, I've come to believe, is no. Because when you can justify any behavior by saying the other side does it too, partisan gullibility becomes a virtue, not a vice. Think about all the people who share New York Post, InfoWars, and Breitbart articles to win arguments on the internet, but tell you major reputable news sources are fake news. I'm sure it's tempting for some people responding to this to say they're expressing poor media literacy, but that's patronizing. Because they aren't simply mistaken. Whatever their private emotional turmoil, many of them are hateful and implicitly or explicitly subscribe to supremacist ideologies. But now that we've addressed some generalities of the situation, including why this evidence isn't very strong, and why I don't take these people seriously as a rule of thumb, I'd like to look at some associated claims. These come from an Endymion video, looking at the same alleged leaks promoted by NER.
Let's get into what was leaked here because it's a lot. Firstly, the playtester claimed that the game is full-on modern audience woke language all over the place. And a lot of the modern 2024 real-world nonsense is present in this game, which is very much not the real world at all and shouldn't be in here in the first place. For example, Tosh, the Kunari companion in the game, you know, the one who's ugly as sin, apparently tells Rook, the main character in their first encounter, that Tosh is non-binary. Like they just straight up say that and throw it in your face immediately. This is already awful and fills me with despair, but it keeps going. Next is that besides the pronouns nonsense being thrust down your throat, the game's romances are allegedly locked based on your choices in the character selection screen. Apparently in the build of this game which the tester played, if you chose the pronouns he, him, and confirm that you're straight, then you're immediately locked into only two romance options for your character, which is Nev or Neve, the Ice Mage brown lady person, and Harding, the dwarf girl from Inquisition. However, if you confirm that your character is pansexual in the character creator, then you are actually able to romance anyone in the game regardless of your gender or pronouns. Apparently, this feature may have been changed due to Baldur's Gate 3's success, which allowed you to romance anyone no matter what you were, but the jury is still out on this one. But the fact that you can only have two romance options if you are a straight man is ridiculous to me, which means you can't romance the Asian elf chick. I believe her name is Balara if you're a straight man, but maybe you can if you're gay, or they're only into women. But if you're pansexual and a man, then Balara is magically suddenly available to you. Notice how all of this is convoluted nonsense and is just more current dayisms in modern gaming. I hate it here, man, but there's more.
Now, I've caught Endymion lying about things before, link in the description, but that's not really any great achievement. I could call him a tourist here, and to be fair, it would be totally justified. It's not a word that I like, because I actually think welcoming new people into communities helps those communities grow in a positive way, and I like sharing games I love with other people. However, I have to admit, it's pretty suspicious that Endymion would say this about the transgender character in Veilguard. Fans of Dragon Age will recall how in Inquisition, there's a few points at which the Inquisitor, the player character, can converse with another member of the Inquisition, Krem, about the fact that Krem is a transgender man. This isn't quote-unquote 2024 nonsense, because it was already in the series in 2014. The same goes for some romance options being locked upon character creation, a change partially present in Dragon Age Origins, but fully realized in Inquisition as one of the series' most progressive changes. Dragon Age was lauded for this back when it was introduced, and it remains a feature that adds an immense amount of character depth and game replayability. Inquisition also has a scene where Iron Bull introduces the Inquisitor to Krem and mentions if Krem were Kunari, he would be a Kun Athlok, which is Kunlaut for a person who is assigned one gender but lives as another, which in turn implies there have been transgender Kunari for a decade at least in the canon of Dragon Age. Endymion is 10 whole years too late to be making these kinds of proclamations. All of these people faking their Dragon Age street cred just to farm clicks talking smack about LGBTQ people are so transparently ignorant about the series that it's impossible to know literally anything about Dragon Age and not see how they're lying to your face. A fact made evident by the part where Endymion just starts making up hypotheticals and then tells the audience that the hypothetical is confusing because the developers made it confusing and not because he made it up to be confusing, which he did. This isn't even ignorance, this is sheer malice, abundantly obvious even in an age when it's hard to tell the difference. Speaking of which...
The options feel almost endless. There's even a glute slider. And yes, I gave my rogue...
No, it could have been way bigger than that. Yeah, it should be way... That should be, guys, that should be 20%. That's it? That's like nothing, bro. Like... Oh my god. At least it's I guess. Well, what about... Are they going to show the dick slider? Let's see what we got with that.
One hell of an ass. All of this is only scratching...
Yeah, right. Like, apparently this girl doesn't spend 4 hours like I do on Instagram every day. No, it's not. In the Veilguard, you can actually show, you can have an indicator here where you can have top surgery scars in order to emulate what your scars would look like if you had trans surgery. I think this is one of the most lazy and devoid of any degree of creativity examples of why you should expect this story in the game to be soft, modern, flat, and garbage, and completely uncreative. So we live in a world of magic, demons, dragons, and shape-shifting. However, you still need to undergo a, surgery in order to change your gender. What a ridiculous thing to say. It doesn't even make sense. So when I see something like that, and then I see the character's skin tone be referred to as melanin, I see an image of a game that is made to reinforce a real-world view and be a hyper-reality rather than a fantasy world. I find it to be very weird. And I don't think that you should expect to see a story that's written by a studio like that have any sort of depth to it, have any degree of edge, any sort of internal truth. I think that you can expect to see an extremely flat and extremely dull and a very soft modern story that takes no risks and only reinforces what the artists and the writers that are making it want you to believe about the real world. That's the way I feel. It feels condescending. It is. And so that's my opinion. And I understand that people might not think this, but I want everybody to clip what I'm saying here, and let's take it to the bank whenever the game comes out, and we'll see if I'm right or not.
Those clips are probably slightly confusing to some of you, so I feel the need for a little elaboration. If something seems a little off about what Asmongold was saying here, it's firstly because his rant comes off incredibly forced. Beyond the strange butt-related comments, it's really weird how little he has to say beyond regurgitating, like Melanie Mac before, just another Grums tweet along with some pablum about present-day culture. Why it would be uncreative to add something like this is beyond me, since if anything, proactively building upon the setting is a strictly creative act, but my man is talking straight nonsense anyway. First of all, that's not what hyperreality means. Hyperreality is when signifiers are treated as stand-ins for what they signify. There is straight up no way this dude is reading Baudrillard. And what does he mean by internal truth? You can't just slap vague emotional phrases into a speech and act like it's cunning analysis of a work of art. But it goes further than that, because Asmongold is talking complete garbage here. Dragon Age Inquisition not only had a transgender character who was accepted by his comrades, he also makes explicit references to chess binding when he jokes with Iron Bull and the Inquisitor in one of the scenes. If you explored all the dialogue with the Chargers, you might remember this. Chess binding is a practice similar to top surgery but obviously less permanent, whose core function is to reduce gender dysphoria related to breast size for transmasculine individuals. Characters in Dragon Age have been able to have scars well before the Veilguard, and the idea that top scars invalidate one's sense of one's own gender in any way that breasts would implies scars would produce the same dysphoria, but for many people that's not true. This is what happens when cisgender people talk about what it means to be transgender in a way that only supports their prior views, and without any deference to how trans people really experience transness. Moreover, demons, dragons, and shapeshifting might exist in the Dragon Age universe, but they're hardly mundane. It's normal for people in Thedas to have scars, unless you know nothing about the history of magic, Tevinter, Andraste, the Chantry, and the Circles, you couldn't say something like this. Magic is controversial in Thedas. Shapeshifting isn't a universal power even among mages. Coincidentally, the character I was using to record footage in Inquisition when this discourse blew up has scars, but so do characters like Iron Bull, Cassandra, and others. Asmongold is smoking crack. He just made a bunch of stuff up and fearmongered about something that has functionally had a place in Dragon Age forever, based on pure vibes. I'm sure a bunch of people will believe it, because if the claims are phrased vaguely enough and the standard of evidence is any intuitive reaction you might have to a given stimuli, then naturally anything can be anything. Now, it's completely beyond me whether Asmongold is just so stupid and biased against queer people that he would genuinely buy this argument, or whether he's just actively lying to his audience. Flip that coin, I guess. However, there's something a little bit deeper going on here, and for that, I'd like to direct you all to a documentary produced for the BBC by John Berger about the traditions of European paintings, particularly this episode about how women are portrayed in the arts.
Most nudes in oil paintings have been lined up by their painters for the pleasure of the male spectator owner, who will assess and judge them as sights. Their nudity is another form of dress. They are condemned to never being naked. With their clothes off, they are as formal as with their clothes on. Those who are not judged beautiful are not beautiful. Those who are given the prize. The prize is to be owned. That is to say, to be available.
In fandom spaces, extra judgment is foisted upon members of minority groups, women included. Their place in the fandom is under increased scrutiny in no small part because they do not proportionally occupy the normative role of spectator-owner. Gamer is the hard R for white men. Thus, the role of members of minority groups becomes to exist as an ideal that is simultaneously pleasing and non-disruptive to those same white men whose role is established by said norm. All members of minority groups in video games serve at the pleasure and permission of their perceived betters. You might call this the gamer gaze. Truly, it is merely the extension of a well-worn cultural practice which is inviolate across so much of our society. To contest this practice is to contest one's own fate as a member of a subordinate class. I'd like to address another elephant in the room as well. See, not all the content creators talking about this upcoming game are doing a bad job. Not all of them, for example, are obviously pushing right-wing talking points about minorities. There are a couple channels, such as Mortismal Gaming and Kayla Elizabeth, who I think have produced critical but sincere perspectives on the game, talking about what they thought worked and what they thought didn't. I don't watch that much of Kayla Elizabeth's content, but I've seen her stuff around in BioWare fan spaces online, and I watch Mortismal Gaming often to understand how to be less awful at Pillars of Eternity or Pathfinder, two game series I got into by checking out his reviews in the first place. Of course, because these content creators gave at least largely positive reviews of the game or recommended it at all, people have started running around accusing them of lying or being paid off, which is a very normal way to talk to people who liked a game you didn't on the internet, or who liked a game you didn't play but somebody you followed didn't like. There's also small content creators who make videos pushing back on the way right-wingers seem to infiltrate fandom culture, like TTBN Gaming, who has covered the situation pertaining to Dragon Age the Veilguard a couple times. I was watching one of his videos and left a comment talking about how all this discourse had convinced me to check out and review the game myself, despite the fact that I would need to upgrade my lo-fi setup in order to do so. I don't usually talk about comment sections in my videos, but I feel the need to here, because something weird happened. I got a reply to my comment recommending that I watch a creator called SkillUp and his review of the game. It seems like he's made a few videos about the Veilguard, including discussing it with other creators. I mostly felt like what he had to say was pretty vague, and since the only thing that would have actually stopped me from trying the game out for myself was if there was confirmation of some major bug or glitch that made it unplayable, or something that game-breaking, it really didn't sway me either way. But he said something very odd at one point.
The writing is frankly terminal. It lacks any nuance or wit or wisdom. It cannot communicate ideas except to say them aloud to the camera. It manufactures petty, unbelievable tension because it doesn't know how to create anything more real, and it's too scared to ever be truly confronting or dark for fear that it might make the audience uncomfortable. Every interaction between the companions feels like HR is in the room, and every interaction led by the main character, Rook, sounds like he's addressing an under-12 soccer team before a semi-final, or teaching toddlers how to properly share toys. The way you build relationships with your companions is so woefully outdated. Drawn-out quest lines completely divorced from the main plot, starring disposable villains and recycling the same settings, enemies, and bosses you find elsewhere. The romance system feels equally antiquated, heavily reliant on the "we'll bang, okay" button, even when it doesn't make sense for that to be an option, with no supporting systems behind it to make your romance decisions feel believable or consequential.
I don't want to give you the wrong impression, so let me just say that this comment was just a throwaway remark. But let's consider the larger context. I don't like what he says here, because in the context of Dragon Age, a lot of writing is dialogue writing, which he more or less calls out explicitly. That would be fine, but it's odd that so much of the major focus has been on LGBTQ identities and themes in writing elsewhere. That might not seem like it's relevant to the SkillUp video, but did you hear the part where he brought up human resources? What did he mean by that? He says later on that it feels like the player character isn't allowed to offend the party characters, and that's fair because interpersonal conflict is a big part of the previous games, but in my experience this particular phrasing is a common complaint of how works of art will represent sensitive ideas in an overly safe manner, especially in the context of minority identities and struggles, which we already know are a major part of the writing of this game. This type of criticism is a common way of calling out poorly done representation of marginalized people and their associated social issues in a work of art, because the parallel is to a corporate human resources department, which restricts how offensive statements about such groups can be. It's a kind of critique I'm quite familiar with, having had the same thought myself in other situations. I ask again, what did he mean by that? I'm not aware of the identity of Ralph, the individual speaking in that video, so for all I know, he could have some close personal experiences with queer identity, but I don't recall seeing him invoke those either. If this is a cisgender man, much less a heterosexual cisgender man, although again, I can't say, speaking to the approach by a video game towards transgender and other queer issues, implicitly because that's a big part of some of the companion dialogue, then he should come correct. He should have the facts and lay out his reasoning, but the video is remarkably vague on this topic. I'm almost certain that Ralph didn't intend that kind of negativity, because multiple parts of his video are calls for the audience to seek out alternative perspectives from people who liked the game, which he probably wouldn't do if he had it out for the developers. But looking at his comment section and thinking about the people who have recommended this video to me, I get a different sense of what they think this review is for. I can only conclude that I understand why he didn't like the game per his stated reasons, but he phrased that comment really weirdly, and this makes it even odder in context to have people use this video as some kind of definitive proof that the game is definitely bad, especially in the context of people like me having real complaints about bigotry and how other creators who aren't Ralph are willing to speak about it. After watching, I can say that recommending this SkillUp video to somebody as proof that a game they're interested in playing is definitely bad is clearly not the point of the video and shows just how dogmatic a lot of the discourse has become. The reason I brought up that YouTube comment section earlier wasn't just to talk about how I got recommended a negative review of the Veilguard by someone who misrepresented it. I also saw a commenter bring up something strange about a YouTuber named Mr. Matty Plays as I kept scrolling. I thought that name sounded familiar even though I didn't think I had ever seen a video by the guy. And yeah, It turns out he's this guy in the upper right-hand corner of the Skill Up video I showed earlier. I checked online and saw this weird discussion unfold in real time. The quick version, sources in the bibliography and the description, is that Mr. Matty Plays released a negative review of the Veilguard, but he had created his own custom character that appeared in his footage. A far-right anti-Semitic Twitter account that posts homophobic and racial slurs also posted footage talking about his supposed reviewer friend who got an earlier copy, and in the footage you can see the exact same custom character as the one that appears in the Mr. Matty Plays footage. This sparked a big discussion that has culminated at time of writing in the right-wing leaker deactivating and then reactivating to make even more remarks about Jews, all the while leaving Mr. Matty Plays to write about how apparently his editor leaked the footage he sent to them, and somehow it changed hands enough times for a neo-Nazi to get it. I've heard it said that everybody on the planet is connected by 6 degrees of separation, which means presumably you know somebody who knows 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 a Nazi. However, I think things are a little more tenuous when it comes to trust in business relationships. I think if I trusted somebody with my product obtained through an NDA in a work setting, I'd be pretty shocked to turn around and find it immediately in the hands of a guy who thinks it's normal to tweet the N-word as a pejorative. I would have some pretty serious questions about who trusted who enough such that this happened. What's going on with gaming communities that these far-right ideologues and hateful bigots are able to attach themselves to these discourses, assuming figures like Skill Up and Mr. Matty Plays really have no intention whatsoever of playing into harmful rhetoric and are just working in the wrong place at the wrong time? Well, I think it's a little complicated, but this is a learning experience. Creators like Endymion, or posters like that one weird Twitter racist, posture as real gamers or real fans in order to do 2 things. First, they want to imply that their views are already, and therefore to someone whose moral and social worldview revolves around normality, should be, mainstream within the community. This has the dual benefit of disguising themselves and casting suspicion on those who disagree. They weaponize the biases of bystanders. Second, and this is probably obvious, this rhetorical tactic allows them to weaponize fan identity against outgroups, real or perceived. They targeted gamers. Gamers. It all has that exact tenor. There's a great video by Innuendo Studios in his series The Alt-Right Playbook, the video series that inspired my videos on videos about The Last Jedi, and at one point, he says this.
The adage about bros on the internet is political means anything I disagree with. But it would be more accurate to say here, political means anything on which the community disagrees. For instance, Nazis are bad is an apolitical statement because everyone in the community agrees. It's common sense and therefore neutral. But paradoxically, Nazis are good is also apolitical. Because Nazis are bad is the consensus, Nazis are good must just be an edgy joke, and even if not, the community already believes the opposite, so the statement is harmless, tolerable. However, feminism is good is a political statement because the community hasn't reached a consensus. It is debatable and therefore political, and you should stop talking about it. And making political arguments, no matter how rational, is having an agenda, and having an agenda is ruining the community. Now, it is curious how the things that provoke the most disagreement tend to be whichever ones make white dudes uncomfortable, one of life's great unanswerable mysteries. You can gather where this is going. A community that doesn't tolerate progressivism, but does tolerate Nazism, is going to start collecting Nazis. Nazis whose goal is to drive a wedge between the community and the left. Once the left acknowledges, hey, your community's developing a Nazi problem, the Nazis, who are, remember, trusted apolitical members of the community who might just be kidding about all the Nazi shit, say, did you hear that, guys? Those cultural Marxists just called all of us Nazis. Wedge. Similarly, any community members who say, but Nazis, though, are framed as infiltrators pushing an agenda, even if they've been there longer than the Nazis have. They get the wedge, too. This is how fandoms radicalize. They are built as, yeah, I'll say it, safe spaces for nerds, weebs, and furries, and are told that the left is a threat to their safety. Given a choice between leaving a community that has mattered to him for years and simply adjusting to the community's shifting politics, the assumption is that Gabe will stay. This assumption is right often enough that a lot of fandoms have been colonized.
I don't think it takes an intelligent individual presenting a well-researched documentary series on the coalescence and tactics of a far-right political movement to note just the conspicuous nature of neutral common sense. Conservatives and other right-wing ideologues tend to rely heavily on intuitive appeals, like what John Berger says about aesthetics, where conventionally those women are beautiful who are judged beautiful, those acts are moral which are judged to be moral. Right-wingers like to conflate those judgments with reality itself, which is how they get objectivity out of a judgment that is itself objectively, factually grounded in their culture, in their time and place in history. It's good to be suspicious of common sense, not because it's always wrong, but because some pretty awful and manipulative stuff can be snuck into your worldview and your community if you just accept what other people already as a rule themselves accept. You can see in that Innuendo Studios clip exactly how right-wingers manipulate the narrative. They tactically deploy existing community ideas in a manipulative manner to bias people in favor of accepting rhetoric they can exploit and against using other rhetoric that would be inconvenient for them. They then use rhetoric and manipulative phrasing to attempt to sort people into those they can fold into their movement and those to whom they must be opposed. In a few easy-to-teach and easy-to-learn maneuvers, they can shut down opposing progressive ideas and softly float regressive ones to the top of the community's consciousness. All of a sudden, it's normal to call everything CRT, DEI, and woke, even if, when push comes to shove, lots of people seem to have different, highly specific, and frequently mutually incompatible ways of explaining what they mean by that. The trick is that they don't have to explain because they agree in practice, and with a dog whistle, practice is the whole point. There's this funny quote from Lee Atwater, well, not funny haha, but you know what I mean, that people sometimes mention when they talk about dog whistles. Atwater worked for Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign, but notably, Reagan helped Barry Goldwater campaign much earlier, and it was Goldwater who began to win over the American South for conservatives. The subsequent conservative Southern strategy to use, among other things, race and racism as a wedge issue between Americans would go on to be the subject of the following quote from Atwater.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968 you can't say nigger, that hurts you, backfires, so you say stuff like force busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
These content creators have learned their lessons well from the manufactured discourses handed down from conservative think tanks. They readily tell you all about CRT, DEI, and ESG, and they rarely even feel the need to tell you how they could possibly know with evidence that an entertainment company is including minority representation in their video game or television series or movie as the result of some kind of corporate mandated hiring practice, or to get a better rating based on equity in the workplace, or what either of those things would even have to do with minority representation to begin with. Even if they did have something to do with it, and that's a pretty obviously tenuous connection, isn't it weird for these guys to complain about it? Isn't the whole point of believing in capitalism supposed to be that financial incentives also drive innovation that creates good things? So it shouldn't matter to somebody who thinks capitalism is the best system we could be operating under that companies pursue representation in media for profit's sake, right? I am neither the first, nor will I be the last person to note that these reactionary movements take an impulse that could lead people to socialism, to critique of capitalism, and instead get them to redirect their energy at minority groups. This is why they beat the get woke, go broke drum, because if they can delude themselves into buying the idea that these things aren't profitable, then they can preserve their image of capitalism and still redirect that negative hatred at minorities. Of course, that implies some agenda to do with minorities is making companies lose money for the sake of marginalized groups, which calls into question what group they assume is pulling the strings to inject a covert agenda into corporate products for sinister purposes against financial incentives. Guys who believe all that stuff are exactly one step away from asking the Jewish question. Where do you think all these neo-Nazis come from? A channel called The Critical Drinker has an answer for this. I'd like to do a whole separate video on this guy in full, because the facts are even stranger than I could ever paint them as being here. But the truth is that his rhetoric is an important piece of this puzzle. The title of that Asmongold video isn't a coincidence, and neither is the fact that this phrase appears in comments on Dragon Age the Veilguard videos. These guys can't stop talking about the modern audience. Who is the modern audience? Well, to put it as simply and as straightforwardly as possible, the modern audience is a hypothetical, a group of people that the Drinker and many others who use this phrase posit as non-existent. The modern audience is a myth, they would argue, held onto by delusional corporations who don't know that by going woke, they'll be going broke. At least, that's what a lot of these guys think. What this does is present the previously explained contradictions in the beliefs of the people spouting off about DEI and ESG while also saying, get woke, go broke, in clear ideological terms. It's the missing piece of the puzzle. Somebody is influencing these corporations to go against their incentives by diluting them with some kind of ideological fiction, or so figures like the Drinker would have you believe. If you're familiar with the steps to this dance, you probably saw this coming, but of course, the modern audience is to the aforementioned contradiction in anti-woke belief as the myth of cultural Bolshevism or cultural Marxism was to the Jewish question itself, an ideological delusion projected by an otherwise pure and neutral system, supposedly, by some interfering baddies, to manipulate it in favor of the minorities. These guys are not beating the Nazi allegations. And now we're getting so abstract, but instead of moving away from issues focused on minority groups, we've made them impenetrable. Maybe some of the people shouting about DEI and modern audiences and wokeness don't know what they're doing. Maybe. But clearly many do. And in the end, the intentions of the actor only make up a certain percentage of the effect of the act. The lion's share of a punch is not where the fist was intended to arc, but rather where it lands and how hard. And this rhetoric does affect members of vulnerable groups. We've reached a point where the quote-unquote neutral position for a lot of gamers is a suspicion of minority groups in especial, which is itself definitionally bigoted, but also a suspicion of any attempt to call out bigotry. People will say that it's because pejoratives for bigots and bigotry have become overused, like a sort of boy who cried wolf. But the boy in that story dies. He gets eaten, at least in most versions I heard growing up. And so when somebody makes that comparison, they're not actually saying they don't believe there is any bigotry at all, at least not necessarily, but rather that they feel they have a good enough cause to write the claims off, and be damned the consequences. It's about as close to I don't care if you get hate crimed as any of those dudes will go without saying as much. It also, quite conspicuously, does not resolve the issue of their equal suspicion for advocacy for equity for members of marginalized groups. It's never wokeness when it's time for cisgender straight white men to talk about how they feel put upon, even though by all metrics they've described a perceived injustice, a supposed marginalization by any other name. Chalk that up to another obvious case of inequity. The deal with discourse about oppression is that marginalized groups are marginalized even in conversations about their own demographic, unless we actively correct in the opposite direction. Any real instance of marginalization is oppressive and unjust without that active correction. But an active correction is an imposition. You have an agenda. You made it political. But what else could you do? You can't be neutral on a moving train. If you are neutral in a situation of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. Hey, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. I'm always told that I'm supposed to ask you guys to like and subscribe and stuff in the script, and I always hate writing it in there because it feels like it just completely pollutes the impactful end of a video if I feel like I've got a really nice note that I want to end on. But I am going to say something here because I have been writing videos about Dragon Age a lot lately. Like ever since May of 2024, I've been uploading a new Dragon Age video to the Patreon on a kind of monthly basis. And by now, I've got probably like, 6 or 7, depending on when this video goes live exactly. And I'm uploading way more. And I'm also streaming Dragon Age the Veilguard very soon. As of the time that this video goes live, it'll probably be, within a few days. And I'm going to really enjoy doing that. I always do like Halloween horror streams when Halloween rolls around. So, I really think that's really going to be what I'm doing when this game drops, unfortunately. But after that, it's all Dragon Age all the time. I'm going to love it. It's going to be great. I mean, I don't know if I'll actually like the game as much as Inquisition. Inquisition's my favorite, I mentioned that. But, like second, third, fourth after Inquisition, not that bad, really. I like all the Dragon Age games, even Dragon Age 2. People say that one's bad. I don't really care. I think it's all right. But yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I am going to have a couple more like public, like non-patron only Dragon Age videos coming up in the near future. And that's going to include some Veilguard stuff, as well as something that I think will tie into this video really well and in a really fun way. That's going to be like more about the games themselves, hopefully, not about the discourse. I'm a little tired of the discourse at this point. But yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the support. And all right, yeah, I'll say it. I'll say it. Hit the buttons, please. Hit the buttons. You know what the buttons do. You know which ones I'm talking about. Hit them. Press them, please. It helps me. I hate doing this. I really. All right. Bye.